As you've probably heard by now, Conservatives in the UK won a crushing victory over the left wing on Thursday, December 12th. The Conservatives will walk away with a majority of 365 seats out of the 650 in the House of Commons, which is a gain of 48. They will have a majority of 83 seats. This will be the biggest majority for the Tories since the days of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Labour, left with just 202 seats, is down 60 from what they won in 2017. Conservatives are on course to finish with more than 43% of the popular vote, and even more noteworthy, Labour has had its worst recorded set of general election results since 1935. This article in the Daily Mail says, "Furious Labour turn on Jeremy Corbyn. Ousted MPs say hardline socialist leader is personally responsible for creating a nasty party and is to blame for 20 years of Tory rule." Labour was engulfed in a brutal civil war today, as moderates warned of 20 years of Tory rule unless Jeremy Corbyn's supporters were removed from positions of power. The bitter recrimination between Mr. Corbyn's hard-left supporters and more moderate factions began as soon as the exit polls last night accurately predicted the party's brutal pummeling at the hands of voters. Hilariously, Laura Parker, the head of a grassroots group called Momentum, even claimed it was unquestionable that Labour's policies are popular, despite the overwhelming Tory majority. MPs plowed into Mr. Corbyn and the hardline socialist faction around him, warning that they were setting the scene for decades of Tory government. Mr. Corbyn tweeted this morning, It was a very disappointing night, but I'm proud that we took our message of hope, unity, and justice to every part of this country." His allies tried to deflect personal blame away from him as they said Brexit was the cause of the party's dismal showing. Now, whether it was his horrible personality, his horrible politics, or Brexit, I assume it was probably a mix of all of those things. One of the things I want to examine is this fear of 20 years of Tory rule. What's going on with that? And I think when you understand it, you'll begin to understand why we've seen such hysteria on the left over here in the States and over in Europe. So pivoting from politics, I want to think about this in terms of something else we're all familiar with. Take, for example, markets. There was the dot-com bubble, or the internet bubble, that was a period of excessive speculation that went from about 1994 to the year 2000, and it coincided with a massive growth in use and adoption of the internet. There was an unprecedented amount of personal investing, and there are stories of people quitting their jobs to engage in full-time day trading. Other symptoms of this hysteria were the Wall Street Journal ran articles suggesting that investors rethink the quaint idea of profits. At the height of the boom, it was possible for a promising dot-com company to become a public company via an IPO and raise substantial money even if it had never made a profit. People who received employee stock options became instant paper millionaires. This growth over profit idea brought with it the aura of what was called a new economy. And while I was in high school at the time, I remember kids I was in school with who were buying penny stocks with their family, their dad or their uncle, and telling me how they were going to get rich. It's this phenomenon when waiters and busboys are all giving hot stock tips. Everybody is invested in the market. It's this mania. You get this huge bubble. Years later, a friend of mine that was a few years older than I was telling me how people she knew were buying boats using their stock options as collateral. And And if you don't know what a stock option is, it's about the most volatile investment you can possibly have. And the idea of using it as collateral for a boat just shows how heady those times were. And then, as all manias go, it crashed. During the crash, many online shopping companies such as Pets.com, Webvan, and Boo.com, as well as communication companies such as WorldCom, Northpoint Communication, and Global Crossing, failed and shut down. So just for an example here, let's look at a chart of Cisco systems. You can see it back here in the early 90s, just kind of bumbling along. And then you have this huge spike that's 98, 99, all the way up here to the peak of March of 2000. And then we had a very sharp drawdown. And then this, they call this a dead cat bounce in August. And then a sharp collapse. And down here, it went down until around 2002. And you can see it was about the same level as it had been 5 years ago. And so if you had invested in this peak of this market hysteria in March of 2000, you could see all the way for the next 20 years, you still wouldn't have even made your money back. You wouldn't have got your original investment back. It's taken 20 years of being in the negative. And this is why these guys on the left are freaking out, is because they realize their cultural momentum may have peaked. And now they're in this phase right here. You might see a little bit of a bounce. This might be the 2018 elections, for all we know. But we could very well be seeing a collapse of support for this far-left ideology. And it could be a generation before anybody's willing to listen to these crazy policies again. Just as in the dot-com bubble, we saw all the signs of hysteria that I listed earlier. We are seeing the signs of a cultural hysteria, an ideological hysteria. And the censorship is a big thing. People whose ideas are winning don't resort to censorship. It's like every day there's something new and something crazier, pushing the envelope higher and higher. And this is the sort of thing that you see at the peak of hysterias. And then you see the collapse, and it's going to be a lot like the collapse in Cisco's stock price. It went down 89% peak to trough. And you may very well be seeing the leftist ideology falling flat on its face, hopefully. But we'll watch and see what happens here. None of this is without historical precedents either. When you look at the witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, there was the final last bloody hysterical day where all these witches were hung, and then sanity began to return, interestingly, when there began to be legal damages for false accusations. And then it was like normalcy returned. And there was a much greater tolerance for behavior that would have been condemned before the witch trials than afterwards, because people were so sick of the absolutely puritanical attitude that had dominated. And so you're probably going to see a cultural shift like that too. And it's worth remembering the point that markets don't undercorrect. When that pendulum started swinging away from Cisco, the stock price didn't just return to fair value. It didn't just return to even. It absolutely and completely collapsed. So if you look at the political compass here, you see Jeremy Corbyn in the lower left quadrant, and we appear to be swinging up to this upper right quadrant with more of a Trump, Boris Johnson mentality, which, if this is the case, it pretty much spells the end of an era for the globalist one world government, George Soros type machinations that we've been seeing that have really been powering a lot of this hysteria and broadcasting these crazy voices. And the panic and the doubling down stems from an intuitive grasp that We are undergoing a major and permanent cultural shift. Of course, this analysis isn't particularly insightful because it seems even Joe Biden seems to recognize this when he says Boris Johnson victory portends doom for more leftist Democratic Party. And he says the historic victory in Britain should send a warning to Democrats in 2020. Look what happens when the Labour Party moves so far to the left, Biden said, predicting the headlines out of the parliamentary election results in Britain. Biden reminded Democrats that he was the candidate that could unite the party and defeat Trump, who he argued was similar to Johnson. You're also going to see people saying, my God, Boris Johnson, who is kind of a physical and emotional clone of the president, is able to win, Biden said. And I think it's worth noting it finally looks like Brexit is going to happen. And it took more than one election, it took 2 elections to seal the deal. The globalists resisted the outcome of the Leave vote. But now with this second victory, they've basically been forced to admit that Brexit is going to happen. And I suspect the twisting and turning and resistance we see to Trump could finally be defeated if there is a big win in 2020. President Trump, of course, was delighted by the news. Celebrate Boris, Trump wrote on Twitter, and he predicted a swift trade deal with the United Kingdom after they left the European Union. Boris Johnson added, I want to thank the people of this country for turning out in a December election that we didn't want to call, but which I think has turned out to be a historic election. Gives us now, this new government, the chance to respect the democratic will of the British people and to change this country for the better and to unleash the potential of the entire people of this country. And that is what we will now do. And so maybe, just maybe, we finally reached peak nonsense.
Perhaps things are not as bad as they seem.